Now that we've got those little bugs out of the way, let's move on to what is arguably the most important topic in iOS development, and that is the whole process of network calls, right? Using a network call to hit an API, get the JSON back, parse that JSON, and turn it into an object that you can display into the UI. So we're going to do most of that in this video, right? We're going to create our network manager, which is going to be a singleton. Yeah, I said it, singleton. And we're going to talk about like the pros and cons of a singleton, why many people hate the singleton. Some people think they're okay. It's a very controversial topic. We're going to discuss all of that. Then we're actually going to write out our network call, parse the JSON we get back using Codable. So if you're not familiar with Codable, we're going to talk about that. And then finally, we're going to call the function in the follower list screen and print out the array of followers that we get, right? Because what you need for a collection view or a table view, you need an array of objects to show in that table view or collection view. So what we're going to end this video with is getting that array of followers. So then in the future videos, we can go ahead and start building that collection view. So let's talk about that dirty singleton word. Like I said in previous videos, programming is such an opinionated profession. You're gonna get all kinds of different opinions. This is a hotly debated topic. Like I said, a lot of people hate them. Some people are like, yeah, they're fine. I land in the camp of, I understand their dangers. We're gonna talk about their dangers, but using a handful and using them properly, I think is no big deal. So I'm in the camp of like, use them in moderation. So let's talk about what they are real quick. And for that, let's pull up some good old Apple documentation. Managing a shared resource using a singleton. So basically a singleton is like I said, globally accessible. You can kind of think of it as like a global variable. For example, our network manager, there's going to be one instance of that network manager that can be accessed from all over our app. We're going to talk about that a little more in a second. But you create these to provide a unified access point to a resource or service that's shared across the app, like an audio channel, or a network manager, to make HTTP requests. So that's what we're going to create. And I wanted to kind of just define singleton real quick. And we're going to talk about the pros and cons, and that'll help you understand kind of fully what they are. So the pro really boils down to convenience. Like it's just nice to have one global thing that's shared across your whole app. Like it's pretty easy to access that. So that's kind of like what the pros really boils down to. But the cons, like the exact same reason is that it's a con. Like in this example, you have like one global instance of something. It can be accessed and mutated, changed from any part of your app. Like any Swift file can have access to this, which again, very, very convenient. But I said it before, with great power comes great responsibility, right? That opens yourself up to many, many errors. And it's kind of difficult to debug sometimes because anything in your app can change something. Let's say you have a variable on your singleton like username. Well, anywhere in the app can change the username, and that's globally mutated. So you can kind of see how you're opening yourself up to danger. Especially when working on a team, like if a new developer comes in and they don't know this object is a singleton, they may change it thinking they're changing just a single instance of that class, and then they changed it everywhere. So like I said, they're dangerous. And then another thing is they can kind of become like catch-alls. Monolith is a common term in programming that just means like a giant file that holds everything, like just a catch-all place. One place I see this happening sometimes, I'm kind of guilty of it too, is a very common singleton that I use in my apps. We're not going to use it in this app because we don't have the concept of like a logged in user, but I usually have like a user session in my app, right? That manages the login user. It has like their, maybe their username, their JSON web token or JWT, which is what you need to have the user to authenticate. And the user session, makes sense to be a singleton, right? Having access to that user object with all their information attached to it, accessible from all the screens in your app, because at least in the app that I was creating, the user is very prevalent. Like we're using it everywhere for all kinds of network calls and stuff like that. But the danger there is that can sometimes, like I said, become a monolith where it's kind of like the catch-all. So that's another danger of it. But again, I believe using them in moderation, using them correctly is fine. Some people will say it's a bad word, it's the devil, never touch them, that's bad. And that's a fine opinion. So with that singleton discussion out of the way, let's actually start creating ours. So I do a new folder, new group, called managers. And this is actually a common thing. I've even mentioned this on Swift News before, that a lot of times apps can end up having like 10 things called manager. Like we're going to have network manager, persistence manager. So be careful not to let like all the managers like get out of hand. But new file, it's going to be a Swift file, hit next. And it's going to be our network manager, create. There we go. Class network manager. And the first thing we need to do is let shared, this is how we're going to access it, equal, and we're going to initialize a new network manager. And in order to make this, so part of the things with singletons is you want to restrict it so there can only be one instance of it, right? Singleton, it's in the name. So to do that, we need to make our private init. So we make the init private, so it can only be called here, right? So private init, and it's just empty, and empty curly braces here. So essentially, this little bit of code is what creates the singleton. So as you see here in like the preview code, spoilers, when we access this, we are going to access this using network manager .shared whatever the name of the function is. Oh, and real quick, this has to be static. And what static means is that every network manager will have this variable on it. So you can just do network manager .shared. So like I said, this is the basics of a singleton. These two lines of code are what makes it a singleton. So let's start writing our functions out now. Func get followers, and use some argument labels here for username, because we're going to pass in the username. And that's going to be a string that we're going to pass in. And then we're going to pass in page, because if you remember, right, when I talked about preparing for the network call a couple of videos ago, we need to know, is this the first page of 100 followers? Is it the second page of 100 followers? We need to know which page to get. Whoops, not two. And that's going to be an int. And now we're going to everybody's favorite topic, closures, completion handlers. Like I use them interchangeably. Like it's the same thing to me, right? If you hear me say completion handler, know that I mean closure. And same thing. Sometimes you'll see it called completion handler here, or completed, or closure. I like to do completed. That's just me. And this needs to be at escaping. We're going to talk about this in a little bit here. I'll explain it. And like I said, I'll explain all this, even though I'm typing it out pretty quickly. And this is going to return something. So think about what it's going to return. After this network call is done, we need to either return an array of followers, like it was success. Everything went swimmingly. We have our array of followers, return that. Okay, so that's the first thing, follower. And it needs to be optional because like I just said, we could get an error. We're not guaranteed to return an array of followers because we could get an error. So that's going to be optional. And then on the topic of that error needs to be a string, and that's optional as well. Because if everything goes great, we get the followers, we're not returning an error. So that's why each one of these is optional. It's kind of like one or the other, right? If we have followers, we're not going to have an error. If we have an error, we're not going to have followers. And then this needs to return void. And the parentheses, open up our function, and now we have our function, we're good to go. I know I went over that quickly. I'm going to explain each part of it as we go because it'll make more sense when you can see like the whole function rather than just the signature. But don't worry, we're going to explain every bit of it. The first thing we're going to need in order to make a network call is we're going to need our URL. Like we're going to need to know what endpoint to hit in the API. So let endpoint equal. And in a network manager, you typically have a base URL because when you're working with an API and you're making like 10 different network calls, 99% of the time, the base of the URL is going to be the same. Like you'll see here in the GitHub documentation, if I go to schema here, which is kind of like the layout, all API access is over HTTPS and access from this, HTTPS api.github.com. So that is our base URL. So I'm just going to copy that, go back to Xcode, and we're going to create a base URL variable here. So let base URL equal, and it's going to be a string, right? And so we're going to do that. Now, in this specific situation, we can even take ours a little bit further. I want to give that disclaimer because this may not always be the case. Like most often, if you're working on a fully fledged GitHub app, like this would be your base URL. That's it. But I want to show that you can extend this should it happen. This may actually like not make your app more future proof. Again, I'm just letting you know all that. But for this current app, this app's functionality, we can do this. So it's just /user and then / at the end. So that's our base URL. You know what we got to do, right? Got to do it. Got to do it. So now when we're creating our endpoint down in our function, the first thing we do is base URL plus, we're going to use string concatenation where we're like adding two strings. And now the string that we want to append to that base URL is the follower URL that we want. And in order to do that, let's go back to the GitHub API. So again, users, followers, and here's the endpoint for followers. So you see it's users, and then you pass in whatever username, and then it's followers. And then if you remember, we can add the per page and page equals, remember that? So let's go ahead and copy this and back to Xcode. We're going to paste that in. So now this username is like their filler. So what we do is we pass in this username, and we use string interpolation to do that. So / parentheses username. And what this is saying is like fill in whatever string we pass in here for the username / followers. Now remember, we want to add parameters, right? We want to say how many per page and then what page we're on. So do that question mark. And this is getting into like URL, like formatting, not necessarily Swift development. So we want per _ page. That is going to equal 100. We're kind of hard coding that in. I guess if you wanted to, you could create a variable that says like let, per page followers equal. That way you just had to change that variable and it would automatically change this. it's fine, or you can just change it here, whatever you prefer. And then and for the next parameter, page. Remember, so page is going to equal the int that we pass in here, page. So that is our endpoint. That's the URL we're going to hit. But we don't just pass up this string right here. We have to actually convert that into a URL object. Like Swift has a built-in URL type. So we're going to do a guardlet because it returns an optional, because we want to handle the case. You're going to see when you deal with network calls, a lot of error handling, and that's what we're going to talk about. We want to make sure we actually get a valid URL. So guard let URL equal URL, and it's from a string, not URL file path, just URL string here. And the string we want to pass in is the endpoint that we created up here. So endpoint and else. So basically, if this returns a valid URL from this, we're going to have a variable called URL that you're going to see we're going to use in our network call. But we want to handle like, hey, if this doesn't return a valid URL, we need to return an error. And to do that, like we're not going to call our alert from here. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said when we built the alert, we wrapped it in the main thread. Because if we called the alert from here, this is getting called from a background thread. Like you can't do that. So what we want to do is we want to pass the error message as a string in the closure to our view controllers that are using this, because the view controllers can present the UI. So we're just going to tell the view controller what the error message is, and it's up to the view controller to present the UI around it, the alert. So, and in order to do that, you call completed, and you'll notice you need to pass in two things. So the first thing we're going to pass in is nil for the followers, right? We're not having an array of followers right now because we don't even have a good URL. So the array of followers is nil. And then the error message, I'm going to type in a string right now. We're going to come back and refactor these error messages so it looks nice and neat, one thing at a time. This username created an invalid request. Please try again. So now that we have a good URL, we can go ahead and start writing our URL session data task to actually get the information back from that URL. And to do that, let's do let task equal URL session. And then you can see .shared. So .shared is another example of a singleton. So anytime you see like .shared, .standard, those are singletons. And Apple uses them, quite a bit in their code. So they can't be all that bad, right? .data task. Now we want to do with URL with the completion handler, not just with the basic URL. And the completion handler, like I said, is we're going to get back the data, the URL response, the error. So the data is actually the JSON that we're getting back. So the URL we want to pass in is URL, what we just created here on line 21. And the completion handler, if you hit return in here, now you got to give these things variable names. You can call them whatever you want, but it's pretty standard to call this data, response, error, right? Nothing too tricky. And a good stylization thing, if you like, is some people don't like parentheses on their in their closures like that. So here we have the start of our network call. And what I like to do, because I always forget this, right? If you go ahead and type out all your code, figure everything out, I guarantee you're going to do this in your career. You're going to forget to do task.resume. So this is what actually starts the network call. So many times you'll write out all your code and forget to just type task.resume at the bottom. And why isn't it working? And well, that's why. I also want to back up. Like this is the spot. Now that we kind of have the structure, and what we're going to do in this this closure here is we're going to basically parse the data, or handle the response if it's bad, handle the error if it's bad. We're going to basically handle these three variables in this block of code right here before we start the network call. Now, again, I want to back up to a bigger picture about what I'm teaching here. What I'm teaching here is like the basic native way to do network calls. Because this can be tricky, like this is why like Alamofire, Moya, this is why all those things exist. Many people write their own, networking frameworks. There's many, many different ways to write this. What I'm teaching you is like the fundamental basic native way. There's definitely ways to refactor this and abstract this. Like in fact, Swift 5 just came out with the result type that cleans this up a bit. We're actually going to refactor this in a later video to use the result type. But again, I wanted to teach the basic foundational knowledge first before we started abstracting things away and all that stuff. Consider this like the long division way of doing it, right? That's a good analogy. So like I mentioned before, we're just handling these three variables, data, response, and error. The first thing we want to do, like if there's an error, okay, just get out of here, right? So if let underscore, and basically these are all optional. So we got to unwrap all these optionals. That's why you're going to see things like if let and guard let and all that stuff. So if let blank, and I'll explain that in a second if you don't know what that means, equal error. So basically if the error exists, right? Because if there's no error, this is going to be nil because it's an optional. So basically what if let, and this blank means we're just not giving it a variable name because we're not using it. We just want to check to see if it's nil. If it is not nil, then we want to call our completion handler, completed. It's completed. Remember, every time we call completed, we got to pass in two things, either an array of followers or an error message. So the array of followers is going to be nil because we got an error. And then the error message, I'm going to make generic. We're going to talk about this in a second. Let me type this out before I forget it. It's like, unable to complete your request. Please check your internet connection. Because oftentimes when this error happens, there's like no internet. If there's an error from the server, like a 404 error, a 500 error, or whatever, that's going to be in the response. So like it would have been like, hey, the network call worked, but the response is just bad from the server. Whereas an error is like, hey, this thing didn't even work, which usually means no internet. Why I say usually and why I'm doing the custom error message, which again, we're going to refactor all these strings out. Like this is going to look ugly for a little bit, but we'll fix it. And it's because this is general and vague for the user. I fully understand that. However, the way we've done our UI with the alert and how it's like a fixed thing, like if you do, because you could do error.localizeDescription, which will print out an error. Oftentimes this can be like a whole lot of gibberish, depending on what comes back, and it may not fit within our UI. So this is, I'm kind of doing a contrived example where I'm making sure all of our error messages fit within our UI. Again, if you wanted to take this above and beyond in our custom alert, you could make it adjust to whatever the height of the error message is. You could do that. Or like I mentioned in the beginning, this is the cost of having the custom alert, right? The Apple alert will adapt no problem. You don't have to do anything. So again, there's always trade-offs. So that handled the error. Now let's handle the response. Again, we got to handle the data, the response, and the error. So we'll do guard let response, because we're going to use this, equal response. So basically what we're doing here, the way these work, if you're not familiar, we're creating a new variable name based on this variable. So basically this response is like the new variable name we're going to use. Like up here, when we say guard let URL, this is the URL that we can use in the rest of the scope, which we use down here. So that's the same thing. I know it can be confusing to like use the same name, but that is the convention, weirdly enough. So guard let response equal response as, we have to cast it to an HTTP URL response. And then if we do a comma, we can kind of check that. And then we can make sure that also, if there is a response, now we want to do response dot status code equals 200, else do this. So basically what this line of code is saying, if you're not familiar, hey, is this response not nil? If it's not nil, go ahead and put it as a response. And then a secondary check on that, if the response is not nil, let's check the status code on that response. If you're not familiar with the HTTP status codes, that's kind of like the 404 error, the 500 error. Pulling up the internet here, I have the wiki. I'll link to this in the course, but you can see that 200 is okay. That's what we're checking about. But you can see there's 205, 204, 300s, 400s, 500s, right? Every one of these requests is like a specific error. And if you want to like really go above and beyond, you can give, so basically what I'm checking for, like, hey, make sure I get a 200 back. A 200 means everything went okay. And if I get a 200 back, proceed. And we'll give a generic error that handles all the other codes. If you were really going super detailed, you could give a very specific error message for each one of those codes. Like you would check against a 404 error and give the specific 404 if you'd liked. Again, that's really going above and beyond for the take-home project. Like in a real product, you may want to do that. So all we're checking for is, hey, did we get the status code 200, which means we're good to go and we're going to move on. So else, this is what happens when we get something other than a 200. And for that, we're going to send the error. So we're going to do completed again, nil for the list of followers, right? Because we got a bad status code. And we want to pass back the error. And the error is going to be invalid response from the server. Wow. The server, please try again. So again, we're just doing kind of simple, short error messages, and we want to return. And I forgot to do the return up here too, because if we get the error, we want to return out, like we're done. We don't want to do any more of the function here. So again, we're handling our error. If we get the error, bam, send that. We're handling a bad response. If we get a bad response, we're sending that error message. So we went ahead and handled like the bad cases first. So now we want to handle our data, and then data can also be an optional. So we want to do one more check to make sure we actually have good data. And then once we have good data, we're going to parse that JSON, create our follower object, and that's what we're going to call completed and passing in the array of followers. So down here, very similar here, guard let data equals data else. So this is what we're going to do if leet data. Guard let data equals data. If we don't get good data, we need to show an error. Completed. And again, nil for the array of followers. And the error message is the data received from the server was invalid. Please try again. And again, these are error messages. You can type in, whatever you like. And then again, if we get the error, we're done, we're returning. But now, again, the whole point of guard statements is if this data is good, now we have a variable called data. And now down here is where we're going to start parsing that JSON. So the encoders and decoders can throw an error, so they have a try in front of them. So we use the do, try, catch. If you're not familiar with that, this is a way to handle the errors. So we're going to talk about that here. So do, and then open curly close, and then I put the catch in right here already. And then so do, and then the try will be in here, which you'll see. And then if the try fails, that catches the error, and then you handle the error in the catch block. It's common error handling. So we want to do let decoder equal, it's a JSON decoder. So decoder is taking the data from the server and decoding it into our objects. Encoder is taking our object and converting it to data. So we're going to be decoding data. So decoder, initialize that. Now, remember when I talked about converting from snake case to camel case on our object? This is where we set that. So we do decoder dot, so you can do like data decoding strategy, date decoding strategy. We're going to do key decoding strategy because the key is like, in a dictionary, a key value pair. So the key decoding strategy equals dot, and you can see convert from snake case. There's a couple other ones, default keys. We want to convert from snake case. So now is where we create our array of followers. So let followers equals, remember I said this decoding throws, so you got to put a try in front of it. Try decoder dot decode. And in the autocomplete, you see at the end over here on the right, it throws. That means it throws an error. So that's why we're doing the whole do, try, catch thing. So decode. And then now you have to pass in something that conforms to the decodable protocol. And if you remember, if you go back to our follower object, that's why we made it conform to codable. When you conform to codable, you actually get encodable and decodable. Like codable is the combination of the encodable protocol and decodable protocol all in one. So we're getting them both here. And so back to the network manager. So the follower object does conform to that. So we want to do an array, click in here, an array of follower, and then you have to do dot self because you're showing the type there. From data is the data that we have here, the valid data that we have here on line 38. So data. So again, what this line says is, here, we want an array of followers. We're declaring that constant. So we're going to try to decode it. And the type we have is an array of followers. That's our type. And we wanted to create that array of type follower from data, which is up here on line 38. So that's what that line says. So if this all goes well, we have followers, and that'll be an array of follower objects, that we complete. It'll have a login and an avatar URL. So if this all goes swimmingly, now we call completed, except now instead of nil for the followers, we're going to pass in followers. And because everything went great, we're going to pass in nil for the error message. Now remember, if try fails, it's going to throw an error. And it throws an error in the catch block. So in order to pass the error message, again, completed, nil for followers, because again, bad stuff happened. And then we're going to do the same error message here. The data received from the server was invalid. Please try again. Little copy paste action. Oops. So there we go. And now we're done. We've handled everything. So like I said before, I want to reiterate, this is like the long division version. This is the very fundamental, rudimentary way to do this. There's many ways to refactor this and abstract it away. But like I said, I wanted to teach it this way first, and then we can work on abstractions. Like I said, we're going to refactor using the result type in a later video. And also, if you're anything like me, all these strings look really ugly. We're refactoring that next video, but we're good. Just to recap what we did here, we created our endpoint, which is the URL that actually, let me back up even further and talk about the function signature. So we're passing in a username, which is going to help build our URL to hit, because we need to know the username to get the followers. We also need to know the page, like, hey, is this page 2, 3, 4 for our pagination of our scrolling? And then we're also using a completion handler, closure. That completion handler is going to pass in is going to return either an array of followers or an error message. And again, it can be nil because it's one or the other, right? If we have a follower, we don't have an error message. If we have an error message, we don't have an array of followers. So we create the endpoint we're going to create our URL from with this URL string from the endpoint. Once we get a valid URL, if we don't get a valid URL, bam, return the error message. If we get a valid URL, now we're on to the task. And then we create our URL session with that URL. So we hit that API, it comes back, it's going to return data, response, and an error, right? And these are all optional, like they can be nil. So we got to start handling all those objects, right? If the error exists, then we're just going to return an error message, back out, we're done. If the response, we're only going to move forward if the response is valid, it's not nil, and it has a response code of 200, which means everything's okay. If those conditions hit, we're moving on. We're moving down the list. If those don't hit, bam, throw the error message, we out. Next one, making sure the data is not nil. Cool, if the data is not nil, then we move on to the parsing. If the data is nil, throw the error message, we bounce out. Okay, now we get to like the good stuff here, where we're setting the decoder. We're creating a decoder, a JSON decoder, and this is new with Codable in Swift 4.2. We set our key decoding strategy to convert from snake case. And then here's where we're actually using the decoder, right? We want to create an array of followers. We have to try, because this function throws here. So we want to decode from the data, again, the data, the good data we got up here, decode that data into a type of an array of followers. And then if that goes well, we're going to call our completion handler where we pass in the followers and not pass in the error message because that's nil. And then if, we'll throw the error message. If not, again, make sure you call task.resume. That's what fires this off. So the only thing we have left to do now is actually put this into our follower list VC, test it, and we're just going to print the array of followers to show that, hey, we actually have this. So over in our follower list VC, we're just going to do this in view to load because we're not even on this screen yet. So it's going to look sloppy for now. Actually, we'll do that. So like I said, network manager dot shared, this is the singleton, dot get followers. What is the string we want to pass in? Username. Remember, we were passing data from the search VC. So the data we passed is what we want to pass in. So username. And the page, so this is the first time we're doing it. So it's going to be page 1. You'll see once we do pagination, we're going to be incrementing that page every time we hit the bottom. But for now, page 1. So this is where the completion handler comes in. Remember I showed you like the sneak peek? So if you hit return here, you're either going to get, similar to how we name data response error, you get to name these whatever you like. So I'm going to name this followers, and string is going to be error message. So followers. So remember back in the network manager when I said, hey, completed, followers is nil, here's the error message. That's what's actually happening here in the follower list VC. This is the followers or the error message we get, right? Because we're going to get one or the other. So the first thing I want to do is to check to make sure we have followers. Because remember, it's one or the other. If we have followers, error message is nil. If we have an error message, followers is nil. So I want to do guard let followers equal followers. Again, so we want to make sure this is actually a value. Else, so if that's not the case, that means we have an error message. And then we'll just print, well, actually, no, we can do this, right? We can do present, because we built this. Present GF alert on main thread with the title. I'm just going to do test. The message, what we'll say, bad stuff happened. The message is going to be the error message, right? Because we're passing that through. Oh boy. And we'll force unwrap that for now. Button title is going to be okay. We're force unwrapping that because, again, we know it's one or the other. Like if we don't have followers, like we know we have an error message. And we'll do self. Now, I'm not getting into the whole weak self capture list. We're going to talk about that in a later video. We're just testing to make sure we have this. And then I return if not, because I want to show you what happens when we have an error and when we don't have an error. So if we get past this guard statement, right, that means we have valid followers. So we want to just print. We're going to print two things. We're going to print followers.count equals, and then we're going to actually, followers, it's going to be the local one that's unwrapped, .count, and then print, we're actually just going to print followers, like the whole array. Do a command B to kind of get rid of all of our errors, hopefully. Build succeeded. Okay, cool. So, like I said, we're calling this, we're either going to get followers or an error message. We're handling, if we get followers, cool, we can move on down to here. If we don't get followers back, we're going to present the error message. And then this is where we'll actually do all the collection view stuff later time. So let's run this and see what we got here. So here we are. Let's try typing a bad thing first, right? So if we just type gibberish, right? The username doesn't really exist. Get followers. Okay, bad stuff happened. Invalid response from the server. Please try again. So you can see our error messages are coming through. That's because the response code was bad because this user doesn't exist. So cool. You see our alerts looking nice. It's working. We're passing the error message properly. And if we go back and now we actually type in a legit name, a super legit name, 0400, hit get followers, and bad stuff happened. Invalid response from the server. Please try again. Okay, so do some debugging here. Stop this. Okay, so we know invalid response from the server. If we go back to the network manager, that would be this one. So the response is invalid. So I probably got a bad response code. I always double check everything from the start. Oh, jumped out right away. So you see our base URL. Remember, so copy paste errors are a thing. Be very, very careful. So remember how I added the users onto the end of this, saying that we could do this. But before, when I copied and pasted this URL, I included this users. So you see, our URL really reads api.github.com/users/users/username. So it's a bad URL. We just want this to start with username because I included that /users up here. Because again, this is the prefix for both the Git followers and Git the users. So hopefully, now when I run it, this should be good. Leaving in the mistakes. We're not going to edit that out. So again, Sean Allen 0400, run it. No error. Okay, cool. Okay, yep, we're good to go here. You see giant text because of my thing, but okay, so followers.count equals 100. Cool, that's right, we wanted 100 followers. And then you can see my array of followers. It's a follower object. Here's the login, here's the avatar URL. Login, avatar URL. I don't know, maybe some of you might see your name in this list, maybe. I don't know. But here's my first 100 followers with their name and the avatar URL. And you can see it's a follower object. So as you can see, we have, I'll make this bigger. Like we have our followers. So right, anytime you try to build a table view or a collection view, you need that array of objects first. We have that. We've made the successful network call. We've handled all the errors. But again, if we go back to the network manager, all right, we can get rid of you now. Like this looks sloppy, right? All these, I just hate seeing a lot of red strings everywhere. That always is just like a trigger for me. So in the next video, we're going to quickly refactor these error messages into a enum called error messages that we can use, and it'll look real nice, and it makes it reusable, and the code will just read a lot better. So we'll take care of that in the next video.